She served him in silence for 12 years. Then one morning, without warning, she was gone. No press, no goodbye, just a single handwritten letter left on his desk. What did Keanu Reeves' most loyal assistant write in that final note? And why did it leave him completely speechless? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. It was 5 a.m. The sky over Malibu was still dark, a deep indigo softening slowly into gray. In the quiet hills, away from the city's restless pulse, Keanu Reeves' property stood still. The ocean nearby whispered against the cliffs, but in the small, detached bungalow behind the main house, another kind of silence had settled. Sarah Nguyen stepped inside, her keys barely making a sound as she locked the glass door behind her. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. For 12 years, she'd walked into this office before sunrise, memorizing every creak of the floorboards and curve of the walls. But today, it felt like walking through someone else's life. One she was ready, forced to leave behind. In her hand was a cream-colored envelope, the kind they used for handwritten thank you notes or invitations to private charity events. No postage, no address, just one word, written in careful, slanted black ink. Keanu. She hesitated at the edge of the desk. It was still the same pine wood slab she had helped him pick out all those years ago. A little too wide, scuffed from his boots, cluttered with sketches of motorcycles, notes from stunt coordinators, and a small stack of unread mail from non-profit organizations that he insisted on reading himself. Next to a well-worn leather notebook was a photo of them both. From a film set 10 years ago, Sarah in a headset and clipboard, Keanu laughing mid-sentence. She placed the envelope down slowly, right in the center of his desk, straightened it once, then again. Her fingers trembled slightly. Then she stepped back, arms folded across her chest, and let her eyes wander around the room. There were stories in every corner. The bookshelf on the left wall held screenplays and memoirs he never finished. The motorcycle helmet hanging by the door still had a crack from that near accident in Morocco. The framed letter from a Make-A-Wish child hung crookedly but had never been moved. Keanu never liked things too perfect. This place had been her second skin. She had managed his schedule, guarded his privacy, absorbed his frustrations, and protected his silences. She had made coffee, booked flights, canceled interviews, arranged meetings with grieving families, and stayed up all night rewriting scripts with him when directors failed to show up. Sarah inhaled deeply, but the air felt heavy. She didn't cry. She had done that already, quietly, over weeks, alone. 12 years, no vacations, no complaints. She never needed a title. She never wanted recognition. But now, all she wanted was release. And that letter, 12 handwritten pages, sealed with shaking hands, was the only way she could find it. Sarah walked to the edge of the office, stopping by the window that overlooked the sleeping garden. A hint of fog curled over the grass, and the faintest pink brushed the horizon. The silence was complete, as if the world itself was holding its breath with her. Her eyes traced the stone path Keanu had laid with his own hands years ago, one summer evening after wrapping a difficult film shoot. He'd wanted something real to come back to, something solid. Sarah had watched him haul every slab into place, refusing help, drenched in sweat but quietly smiling. That had been Keanu. Humble, focused, generous. And yet, beneath all that gentleness, there was a blind spot, one that had taken her years to admit even existed. She leaned against the windowsill, remembering the day she had met him. She was 27, working a brutal job as a production assistant on a chaotic set in downtown Los Angeles. Keanu had shown up early and stayed late. He learned her name before the director did. When a lighting rig collapsed and barely missed her by inches, it was Keanu who pulled her aside, checked her over, and called the medic himself. That moment changed everything. He offered her a job a week later, not because she asked, because he saw something in her. Or maybe because he needed someone who would never ask him for more than he could give. The years that followed were a blur of flights, sets, late nights, and the quiet rituals of building someone else's life. She knew what brand of tea calmed him before interviews. She knew when to cancel meetings and when to just sit in silence beside him. He trusted her in ways he didn't trust anyone else. But trust, she had learned, wasn't always love. And loyalty, when stretched too far, could begin to fray into invisibility. She didn't resent him. That was the hardest part. There was no one to blame. Keanu hadn't done anything cruel or thoughtless. He had simply become used to her being there. Always. That was the quiet heartbreak. That she had made herself so indispensable, she'd disappeared. There had been moments she thought he might notice. When she looked exhausted after pulling an all-nighter. When she canceled a doctor's appointment for herself to prep a charity dinner. When she missed her own brother's wedding because he needed her on location in Vancouver. He had thanked her, every time, kindly, but never asked what it cost. That's what the letter said, not in anger, not in guilt, but in truth. Sarah turned back to the desk. The envelope looked small under the faint morning light, fragile, honest. She hadn't signed her name. She didn't need to. She took one last look around the room. The bookshelf on the right still held the first hardcover biography she ever gifted him. It was about a stuntman from the silent film era, someone Keanu admired not just for his risk-taking, but for his anonymity. He liked people who did great things quietly, people who stayed in the background. Sarah used to believe that was her purpose too. On the far wall hung a framed photo of Keanu with his late friend, River. Sarah had dusted that frame every week without fail for 12 years. She always paused afterward, not out of obligation, but because she understood what grief looked like when it never fully healed. Keanu never said much about the past, but that photo was sacred. She honored it like it was part of her job. There was a dent in the desk drawer where she once slammed it by accident after a heated call from a producer. Keanu hadn't even flinched. He looked up, sipped his coffee, and asked if she needed 5 minutes. She'd gone to the bathroom, cried silently, and came back like nothing had happened. That was how they worked. Quiet storms held under still water. But something had shifted this past year. It wasn't one event. It was the accumulation of little silences. The times she'd started to speak and stopped. The birthdays missed. The dates canceled. The slow erosion of her own reflection in the mirror. He had become her world, but she had stopped being a person in his, and that wasn't his fault. Not really. She had never spoken up. She had buried her needs beneath his. She had told herself this job was a gift, and it was, but it also became a cage she built with her own hands. A week ago, she sat in her apartment, staring at the packed suitcase she'd never dared touch. 12 years, and she had never taken more than a weekend off. She opened it that night, finally placed her passport inside, and wrote the letter that now sat on his desk. She wasn't angry. She wasn't heartbroken. She was simply ready to remember who she was before her name became Keanu's assistant. Sarah stepped away from the desk, touched the doorknob, then paused. She glanced back once, not for him, but for her. One last imprint on a chapter that had shaped her life. And then she walked out, without a sound. 12 years earlier, Sarah Nguyen had walked through the same office doors with a clipboard in one hand and a head full of meticulous plans. She was 27, sharp-eyed, unflinchingly direct, and utterly uninterested in fame. What caught Keanu's attention during the interview wasn't just her resume. It was her restraint. While others dropped names and smiled too wide, Sarah sat across from him, listing schedules, legal requirements, and cross-continental coordination points like a commander reviewing a war plan. She didn't try to impress, she simply delivered. Keanu had just launched his boutique production company and personal charity initiative. It was small, deeply personal, and intentionally kept out of the spotlight. He needed someone to organize chaos quietly, to make his unpublicized kindness possible without press releases or staged photos. He found that in Sarah. Her job title was executive assistant, but within 6 months, she became the gravity holding Keanu's personal and professional universe in alignment. She coordinated film shoots across multiple countries, ensured contracts didn't slip through the cracks, and even kept a color-coded travel binder labeled with everything from dietary restrictions on set to notes about preferred security teams in various cities. She didn't just work for Keanu, she worked through him. Sarah never sought credit and rarely received it. That was fine. She wasn't here for credit. There was a day, maybe 6 years ago, when a major studio crisis erupted. A tabloid had gotten hold of a manipulated photo that threatened to spiral into damaging rumors about Keanu's private life. While legal teams and publicists debated statements, Sarah made 2 quiet phone calls. One to a long-retired journalist who owed her a favor from years back. Another to a digital forensic expert she'd met at a charity gala Keanu funded. Within hours, the photo was publicly discredited. No press conferences, no lawsuits, just silence, where noise was expected. Keanu never asked how the fire went out. He simply thanked her, and she nodded, already moving on to the next task. Sarah had a way of being everywhere without ever appearing in the frame. When Keanu's mother, Patricia, called in tears after her hip surgery, Sarah was the one who gently answered. She rerouted Keanu's calendar that week, canceling a podcast, pushing back a dinner with a director, and booked him on a quiet flight to Toronto under a pseudonym. By the time he arrived, flowers were already waiting in his mother's room, with a handwritten card he hadn't had time to write, but that Sarah had drafted in his voice, knowing what he would have wanted to say. Little things like that, small acts of alignment that added up to a life made smoother. When a former stuntman Keanu had worked with 20 years ago was hospitalized after a workplace accident, it was Sarah who tracked him down. She had remembered the man's name from an offhand remark and quietly arranged for the hospital bills to be paid in full through Keanu's private charity. She never mentioned it. Neither did Keanu. It was one of dozens of such moments, unseen acts of generosity that only happened because Sarah had the instincts to catch details no one else noticed. And there were funerals. She had a list she kept in her head. A director's mother. A young fan who once wrote a letter from a cancer ward. An old college friend Keanu hadn't spoken to in years. When the time came, Sarah would find a way to alert him with empathy, not alarm. She'd send a short, well-worded message. Then she'd make the travel arrangements. She'd ensure no press leaked the location. Once, she'd even stood outside a church during the service to gently ask a paparazzo to leave, and the man somehow listened. She wasn't loud. She was persuasive. She had never missed a deadline, never lost a file, never let Keanu walk into a room unprepared. She'd once stayed up 48 hours managing a last-minute film reshoot across time zones. Another time, she skipped her cousin's wedding because a key donor dinner for the Children's Cancer Fund had shifted locations with no notice. Sarah pivoted effortlessly, without complaint. She wasn't wired to stop. But 12 years of perfection had a price. What no one saw was the cost of always being on call. The canceled vacations, the strained relationships, the silence when someone asked her who she worked for and she smiled vaguely, too private to ever name drop. She had lived inside the rhythm of Keanu's world, adjusting every beat to match his tempo, even as her own life grew quieter, emptier. That Sunday night, hours before placing the letter on Keanu's desk, Sarah sat in her apartment with her laptop open and her calendar blank for the first time in over a decade. There were reminders everywhere in her home, files tucked into drawers, photos of red carpet events she never appeared in, emails flagged but never deleted, a text message from Keanu's driver asking about a pickup time, a reminder to confirm a flight that no longer mattered. Her whole identity had been intertwined with someone else's purpose, and now the stillness felt like a vacuum. That night, as she folded her hands in her lap, Sarah realized something had shifted months ago, maybe longer. Not in Keanu. He hadn't changed. He still sent handwritten thank you notes, still asked about her mother every Christmas, still paused interviews to offer water to a nervous assistant or stagehand. No, it wasn't him. It was her. She had stopped feeling like a person. She had become a system. The breaking point hadn't been dramatic. There was no explosion, no betrayal, just a moment. A moment in an airport lounge 2 months earlier, waiting to rebook a delayed flight for Keanu after a late-night charity appearance. She had looked up from her phone and seen her reflection in the glass. Tired. Alone. 40 on the horizon. And for the first time, she thought, I don't want to be here anymore. Not because she didn't care, but because she had disappeared. 12 years of invisible work had become a life of invisible needs. She knew Keanu would be hurt, maybe confused, maybe angry, but he deserved more than someone running on fumes, unable to remember the last time she laughed without checking the time. He deserved honesty, and so did she. That's why the letter mattered. It wasn't an ending, it was a boundary. Not a goodbye filled with bitterness, but a quiet, steady acknowledgement that her chapter in his story had been long, faithful, and complete. The envelope on his desk, addressed with just his first name in her gentle handwriting, held her final words to the man whose world she had guarded, like her own. And by sunrise, she would be gone. The rain had come without warning that morning, a soft drizzle washing over the streets of Los Angeles, like a gentle reminder that even this city, so often sun-drenched and hurried, could slow down. A small cafe tucked between a print shop and a used bookstore barely stood out. Its neon sign flickered, half broken, casting a faint red glow on the sidewalk. Inside, Keanu sat in a back corner booth. No entourage, no bodyguards, just a man in jeans, worn boots, and a black hoodie that looked like it had seen more motorcycles than red carpets. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold. He wasn't nervous. He just wasn't sure what kind of person would answer the listing his friend had quietly posted. No agency, no public call, just a whisper through personal networks. He's looking for someone who gets it. No drama, no spotlight. At exactly 8:30 a.m., Sarah Nguyen walked through the door. She wore a navy blazer over a simple blouse, slacks, and flats. Not trying to impress, but not here to blend in either. Her hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, and she carried a leather-bound planner, not a phone, in her hand. She spotted him immediately and walked over with a nod, not a smile. "You're Keanu," she said. "And you're Sarah," he replied. "Want coffee?" "I already had 2, she said. "Let's talk." Keanu liked her instantly, not because she was friendly, but because she wasn't trying to charm him. She was present, direct, and when he asked her why she wanted the job, her answer came without a blink. "You need someone who sees what others miss," she said. "I'm that person. I don't need your autograph, I don't need your stories, I just need the schedule, the rules, and the room to make your life run like a silent machine." He raised an eyebrow, sipping his coffee now. "What makes you think I want a machine?" "You don't," she replied, "but your work demands it. You're doing 3 films in the next year, launching a production company, running a foundation with no PR team, and you've got family responsibilities you won't outsource. You don't need a cheerleader. You need a second brain." He couldn't help but smile. She was fast, observant, and somehow not a single trace of arrogance in her tone, just facts, measured confidence. Then he asked her to solve a test problem. Hypothetical but very real, a motorcycle he had promised to restore for a teenage boy with terminal cancer. A Make-A-Wish request. had been delayed because the vintage part needed was stuck in customs. The boy's visit was scheduled in 3 days. Could she fix it? Without opening her planner, she started listing options. Call in a favor from a former customs liaison she knew from her time at an import company, or find a replica part from a shop in Nevada that specialized in rare Kawasaki builds. Or, if those failed, she'd find a mechanic who could fabricate the part overnight. She even had 2 names in mind. Keanu leaned back in the booth and looked at her like someone who had just found the missing puzzle piece. "You're hired." She didn't blink. "Do I get a badge or just your calendar?" He chuckled. "You get both." They left the cafe 15 minutes later, and by the time Sarah got home, she already had 3 voicemails. One was from a contact she had at LAX Cargo Logistics. Another was from an old acquaintance who now worked for a specialty bike shop in Henderson, Nevada. And the third was from a customs attorney she once helped during her brief stint as a project manager for a tech startup's overseas expansion. None of these people owed her anything. They just remembered that when Sarah asked for help, it was always for something that mattered. By that evening, she had the part cleared from customs and rerouted directly to a shop in Burbank. The bike was finished the next day. Keanu didn't say much when she told him, just looked at her and gave a nod. "Thank you," he said. But she noticed something in his expression, something unspoken. Not just gratitude, relief. As if for the first time in years, he didn't have to carry the weight of every detail by himself. The boy arrived 2 days later. His name was Eli, and though cancer had stolen most of his strength, his smile when he saw the rebuilt bike was pure light. Keanu gave him a quiet tour of the shop, let him sit on the bike, even rev the engine once. Sarah stayed in the background, organizing the photographer, ensuring Eli's parents had water, keeping the press far, far away. It was then she understood the full scope of what this job would require. She wouldn't just be an assistant. She'd be a guardian of peace in a life constantly pulled toward noise. Her first week was a whirlwind. No training manual, no onboarding, just a key card, a list of upcoming travel dates, and a note from Keanu that read, "Don't let me miss the stuff that matters." That note never left her wallet. For 12 years. She learned fast when to speak, when not to, when Keanu needed extra time before a shoot, when he'd rather fly coach on purpose to avoid headlines, when he was worried about his sister, when he was mourning quietly, when he was just tired of being recognized. Sarah never asked for his autograph, never took photos. She kept her world outside his orbit clean and separate. A small apartment, a garden she tended early in the morning. No press, no online footprint. And that's exactly why she lasted. Other assistants came and went on the production side. Some dazzled, some burned out. But Sarah stayed constant. Not because she clung to the job, but because she understood its unspoken contract. She'd protected his silence. In return, Keanu trusted her with nearly everything. Family birthdays, memorials, private meetings, letters that needed to be delivered in person, not by mail. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And on the day Eli passed away, 3 years after that first Make-A-Wish visit, it was Sarah who quietly arranged the flight and rental car for Keanu to attend the boy's memorial in the boy's hometown. No one knew he went. No headlines, just 2 flowers on a grave. One from Keanu, one from Sarah. Sarah would later say that her real first day wasn't the interview or even the day she got the job. It was the morning after that first memorial. She'd returned to LA at dawn, running on 2 hours of sleep and still in her black dress shoes. Keanu was already in the office, his head down over a stack of mail. He looked up briefly when she walked in. "You didn't have to come," he said quietly. She only shrugged, pulled a folder from her bag, and handed it to him. Inside was a 1-page summary of travel reimbursements, a draft thank you letter for the boy's parents, and a short list of other Make-A-Wish kids in the region whose paperwork had gone unanswered. Keanu didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he said, "You're not just organized, you care." It wasn't meant as a compliment, but as a recognition, one that mattered. From that moment on, they worked like clockwork. She developed an uncanny ability to anticipate the unseen, the tone of an email before it was opened, the real intention behind a request, the weight of silence in Keanu's voice when he called late at night just to ask if the car was ready for the morning. When his mother needed surgery in Toronto, Sarah had already booked the flight and arranged a driver before Keanu mentioned it. When a scandal involving a false tabloid story erupted while he was filming in Berlin, she handled the PR mitigation in under 48 hours, with no drama, no headlines, and no need for him to cancel the shoot. But through all of it, what surprised her most was how little he asked of her in return. Keanu never barked orders, never demanded loyalty. He simply trusted it when it appeared. And in Sarah, it appeared in full. She remembered a night in 2015, during a bad wildfire season. The studio was pushing him to appear at a red carpet event for a film he didn't even believe in. She'd called the studio executive directly and told them Keanu had a personal commitment. The commitment was a small retirement home, where the last surviving stunt double from one of his earliest films was celebrating a birthday. Keanu showed up with cake. Sarah stood outside in the parking lot, making sure no one followed him. That was the job. That was always the job. Protect the things that mattered. And over time, Sarah stopped thinking of it as a job. It had become something else entirely. A quiet vow, one she'd just broken by walking away. It began with the red-eye flights. Not just once or twice, but weekly, sometimes more. Sarah found herself navigating terminals at 3:00 a.m., juggling phone calls across time zones while sipping stale coffee, her carry-on rolling beside her like a loyal shadow. Keanu's schedule didn't follow a pattern. One week they were off to a children's cancer ward in Nebraska for a quiet visit he insisted stay out of the press. The next, she'd be coordinating a sudden documentary shoot in Patagonia with a skeleton crew and zero time to prep. There was never a warning. Just a moment, Keanu calling her with a soft voice and saying, "I think I need to go." That was all. The rest was Sarah's job. Flights, permits, lodging, security, local transport, confidentiality agreements, catering for vegan needs, and a backup hotel in case the first one felt too public. She learned to carry 4 versions of every plan in her mind, ready to swap at the first sign of discomfort or delay. She didn't just run his calendar, she protected his space, his silence, his moments of presence. During a chaotic month in 2015, Keanu agreed to host a private screening of a film about mental health, with families of affected teens in attendance. It was last minute. Sarah had 48 hours. The theater didn't exist yet, it was under renovation. She somehow convinced the project manager to halt construction, rented folding chairs, brought in a mobile projector, arranged parking for grieving families, and set up tea stations with dim lighting so people could talk afterward. No press, no sponsors, just a circle of vulnerable strangers sitting in the flickering light, and Keanu hugging parents one by one in silence. Sarah never showed up in the photos, but she was always there. Between shoots in Iceland, reshoots in New York, and rescheduled fundraisers in Montana, she kept a rolling file of every promise Keanu had ever made. A veteran he'd told he'd visit in 6 months, Sarah remembered. A child he'd written a birthday card to last year, she followed up. She was the invisible thread between every good thing he quietly did, and each time someone tried to take credit or push a headline. But something else was happening too. Her own life was shrinking. There was the friend's wedding she RSVP'd to, then missed because Keanu wanted to surprise a school principal in Oklahoma whose students had raised money for cancer research. There was the man she had started seeing, a gentle-hearted paramedic named Josh, who left after 6 months, saying he didn't want to compete with someone she worked for, but clearly cared about more than herself. She never argued. She just nodded, then got back to work. Sarah had stopped measuring her life in months or even seasons. Instead, she remembered time through projects. By the premiere in Tokyo where Keanu met a grieving father backstage, or by the winter gala where the catering staff forgot the vegan menu and she stepped in to hand-wrap lentil rolls at the last minute. Life wasn't a series of moments. It was a checklist of other people's emergencies. Her apartment in Silver Lake was more storage than home. Half-hosed suitcases lined the wall like shadows of lives half-lived. The fridge was usually empty. Her plants died regularly. Even her books, once her refuge, had yellowing pages and dog ears from the last time she'd tried to finish one on a flight to London in 2018. That book was still packed in her carry-on. She never unpacked it. Her mother stopped asking when she'd be home for Christmas. Her brother's wife didn't bother sending invitations to their children's birthdays anymore. Not out of anger, just quiet understanding. The kind that came after years of unanswered texts and polite, tired excuses. It was easier to assume Sarah was working and always would be. There were moments, small, flickering ones, that reminded her how much she had given up. She remembered standing in the hallway of a hospital in Seattle. Keanu had just finished visiting a teenager recovering from a serious accident. No cameras, no press, just Keanu holding the boy's hand while his mother wept nearby. Sarah stood outside the door, alone, holding her phone in her palm. It buzzed with a message from her aunt. Her grandfather had passed. The funeral was in 2 days. She blinked hard, pocketed the phone, and looked at her clipboard. Her flight wasn't until morning. She never made it to the funeral. She never told Keanu. It wasn't that he wouldn't have understood. He would have. He might have even canceled the next day's plans to make sure she went. But that wasn't the point. Sarah had built her entire role on not needing to be asked, not needing special treatment. She had told herself again and again that it was okay to come second, or third, or last. But after enough years, something inside started to ache. When people looked at Keanu, they saw someone grounded, kind, and miraculously human in a world of artifice. What they didn't see was the quiet scaffolding behind that grace, and Sarah never needed them to. But she couldn't help noticing how, over time, she had become less of a person and more of a shadow, sliding silently from place to place, fixing what needed fixing, and then disappearing before anyone noticed her name. 12 years of motion. 12 years of erasing herself from the frame. And no one, not even Keanu, ever asked her what that cost. The breaking point hadn't come in a dramatic moment. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just silence. A hotel room in Budapest, another dawn without sleep. Sarah had been up all night coordinating a reshoot in Morocco and managing a donation delay for a children's hospital in Chicago. Her inbox was a disaster. Her coffee had gone cold twice, and the sun was starting to bleed through the curtains. She stared at the glowing laptop screen, the cursor blinking at the end of another email draft she could barely read. Her fingers hovered. Her chest felt hollow, and for the first time in a decade, she let her hands fall to her lap and did nothing. That nothing lasted almost 2 hours. She didn't cry. There were no tears left, just a strange numbness that scared her more than any emergency ever had. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she had done something entirely for herself. Not even a meal, not even a walk without checking her phone. Her world had collapsed into the shape of someone else's needs, someone she respected deeply, but still someone who had consumed her entire life. And it wasn't his fault. That was what made it harder. Keanu had always treated her with gratitude, with quiet kindness, with trust. He thanked her often. He made sure her hotel rooms had blackout curtains and herbal tea. But the problem wasn't whether he appreciated her. It was that she had built her entire identity around being indispensable, and now that identity felt like a cage. Back in Malibu, she started preparing the transition without telling anyone. She documented everything: logins, contacts, special protocols, even reminders for Keanu's mother's favorite birthday flowers. She interviewed replacements under the guise of expanding the team. She trained them methodically. She even wrote backup scripts for Keanu's responses to sensitive press questions in case anything unexpected happened. And then she wrote the letter. It took her weeks. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she didn't know how to say goodbye. Not just to Keanu, but to the version of herself that had survived on adrenaline and self-erasure. The version that had been proud to be invisible, as long as it meant someone else got to shine. But there was nothing left of her in that version now. She needed to be seen again. And for the first time in 12 years, she wanted her name to matter to herself. It was a rainy Thursday morning in April of 2013 when the message came through. Sarah sat in a high-rise conference room overlooking downtown Los Angeles, prepping for one of the most delicate meetings of her career. The room buzzed softly with the hum of city life far below, but inside everything was still, too still. The kind of quiet that wrapped around you when something important was about to happen. Her phone buzzed once. She glanced down. It was a message from her mother. "Dad, surgery. Moved up to tomorrow, 7 a.m. We're all going to be there. He asked about you." Sarah froze. The plan had been next week. She had arranged her schedule around it. Flights, hotel, everything. But now, the timing couldn't have been worse. The donors were arriving tonight, several of them flying in just to meet Keanu in person for a private pitch. The foster care scholarship fund they were launching had taken almost 6 months to coordinate. There was no time to pivot. Her hand hovered over her phone, torn between duty and guilt. She began typing quickly. "I'll try to make it up there by the evening. Keep me posted?" She read it over, then deleted "try" and replaced it with "hope." It felt more honest. But even as she pressed send, she already knew. She wasn't going. At that moment, Keanu walked into the room with his quiet smile and a folder under his arm. Sarah stood, adjusted her blazer, and greeted him with a nod, pushing the personal aside. That was always how she handled it. Set the feelings down, focus on the task, get through the moment. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Phone calls, catering confirmations, background checks for each donor's PR risk. She orchestrated it all flawlessly. The meeting was a success. The donors were moved. One wrote a check on the spot. Keanu pulled her aside after and said, "None of this would have happened without you." She smiled, thanked him, but later, back home, alone with her laptop and cooling takeout, she recorded a voicemail for her dad. "Hey, Dad, I just wanted to say I love you. I know tomorrow's a big day and I really wish I could be there. I'm in the middle of finalizing this scholarship thing. Remember the one I told you about for the kids coming out of foster care? It's happening. I think we finally got it. You always said, we should do what we can for people who don't have anyone. I hope I'm making you proud. I'll call you as soon as..." She ended the message with a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The phone didn't reply. It never did. Then came the text from her mother. "He'll ask if you were coming. I told him you were busy saving someone else's life." Sarah stared at the screen, her mother's message sitting there like a stone she couldn't move. Her father's heart had always been fragile, physically and emotionally. He wasn't the kind to complain, but he was the kind who noticed absence more than presence. And he noticed hers. More and more these days. She set her phone down on the kitchen counter. It was nearly midnight. Her apartment was dark, except for the soft light above the stove. Her shoes were still on. She hadn't even taken off her blazer. The echoes of the donors' laughter still lingered in her ears, clinking wine glasses and soft praise for Keanu's humility. None of them knew what it took behind the scenes. They weren't supposed to. Sarah opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and sat at the edge of the couch without turning on the lights. For the first time in years, she wondered what she was actually building. Not the foundation, not the press statements, not the success of the cause, but the life behind it all. Was there still one? She thought of her father's stories, about growing up poor in South Vietnam, about escaping during the war, starting over in California with nothing but a second-hand tool belt and a thick accent. He was proud of what he'd built. Not the house, not the money, but the time. He was always there for dinner, always there for birthdays, always there for her. She hadn't been back for a birthday in 3 years. She looked around her spotless apartment, clean counters, empty shelves, no photographs, no cards on the fridge. She hadn't even unpacked her last suitcase. She didn't know when she would. When she called the hospital the next morning, her mother's voice was calm but distant. The surgery went well. He's resting now. They gave him ice chips. Did he ask about me? Sarah asked softly. There was a pause. He did. I told him you called. I left him a voicemail, Sarah added quickly. I didn't want him to think I forgot. I know, her mother said. But honey, sometimes people need more than your voice. They need your face. Sarah blinked hard. She nodded into the silence. Tell him, I love him. I will. After she hung up, she sat there for a long time, motionless. There were emails to return, schedules to adjust, meetings to confirm. But none of it moved her. Later that week, Keanu handed her a handwritten thank you note from one of the foster students who'd just been accepted to UCLA. The kid had been in and out of group homes his entire life. You gave me something I didn't know I deserved, he'd written. A chance. Sarah smiled, reading it. But a dull ache remained, the kind that reminded her of what she'd given up to make that chance possible. It was the first time she questioned whether the cost had been too high. 2 weeks later, Sarah finally flew back home. The air in San Jose was cooler than she remembered, as if the season had shifted without waiting for her. She arrived at the hospital with a tote bag of fruit and crossword puzzles, things her father used to enjoy. But when she walked into the room, the air changed. Her father was awake, upright, and calm, but something in his eyes told her he had stopped expecting to see her. Hi, Dad, she said quietly, stepping closer. He turned his head slowly. Look who finally made it, he said with a soft smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sarah placed the bag on the chair beside him. I'm sorry I missed the surgery. I wanted to come, I really did. I know, he said, his voice gentle but tired. You're doing important things. She sat down, trying to bridge the distance with her presence, but the silence between them had weight. She told him about the scholarship fund, about the donors who came through, about the impact it would make. He nodded, polite, listening, but his eyes never lit up. It wasn't that he didn't care, he just didn't know how to tell her that it didn't feel like enough. Later, while he dozed off, her mother sat beside her in the hallway. He doesn't say much, she whispered, but when the nurse asked him if he wanted to watch TV, he said he was waiting for his daughter. Sarah swallowed hard. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I know, her mother said, but it did. That night, Sarah lay awake in her childhood room, the posters faded and the books untouched. She thought about the first job she took out of college, how her father brought lunch to her office because he didn't want her eating alone. He always showed up, even when she didn't ask. Now, he had needed her just once, and she hadn't been there. Back in LA, she buried herself in work again. No one knew the details. No one asked. Keanu thanked her for pulling off a last-minute donor dinner that sealed the scholarship's future for a decade. He called her a miracle worker. But miracles, she thought, don't come without sacrifice. She smiled, nodded, and went back to coordinating the next campaign. But deep down, something shifted. A small crack had formed, and though it didn't stop her, it never really healed. That was the first time she asked herself if saving the world meant losing the people who made you who you are. Was it really saving anything at all? The morning light filtered through the curtains of Sarah's apartment, soft and golden, but it didn't warm her the way it used to. She was already dressed, hair tied up, face composed. Habit, not energy. Her apartment had grown quieter in the past few months, the kind of quiet that comes after a door has closed for good. She stood by the kitchen counter, staring at a coffee mug she never used anymore. It had a chipped rim and the word "breathe" printed in faded teal across the ceramic. It was a gift from Jonah, her partner of 3 years, or ex-partner now. The last words he said to her still echoed in the walls like a forgotten tune. "I love how much you care for him," Jonah had said, eyes heavy and voice gentle. "I just wish you cared for yourself, too." He hadn't yelled. He didn't storm out. He just left quietly, like a man who'd run out of ways to fight for space in a life that had no room for him. He was right. She hadn't been present in their relationship for over a year. She always said she'd come home after the next event, the next meeting, the next crisis. But the next always came, and home never did. Sarah blinked slowly, picked up her keys, and walked out the door. That day, Keanu was scheduled to visit a children's hospital in downtown Los Angeles. The event had been arranged weeks in advance, under complete discretion. No media, no cameras, just a few sick kids, a pile of children's books, and Keanu's calming presence. It was the kind of thing Sarah admired most about him. He showed up when it mattered. He didn't do it for praise. Neither did she, but lately, she'd started to wonder whether showing up for everyone else had slowly chipped away at her ability to show up for herself. By the time she reached the hospital parking lot, she'd buried the pain again. She adjusted her blazer, reapplied her lipstick, and forced the corners of her mouth upward. That practiced smile had been her armor for years. It still fit, but it felt heavier now. Inside, she moved with precision. She greeted the nurses, checked in with security, double-checked the layout of the room where Keanu would sit. She handed off the gift bag she'd personally assembled the night before, each with a soft toy, a handwritten note, and a tiny packet of lavender-scented lotion she hoped would bring the kids some comfort. No one saw the bags under her eyes, the fatigue that clung to her like static. She looked toward the doorway, and there he was. Keanu walked in wearing jeans, a plain t-shirt, and that familiar, gentle half-smile. He greeted every nurse by name, knelt to meet each child at eye level, and asked questions that made them laugh or beam with surprise. Sarah stood to the side, clipboard in hand, checking off items silently, all while pretending her world wasn't quietly caving in. When a little boy with a scar running down the side of his head asked if Keanu was a real superhero, Keanu replied, "No, but I know some real ones, like your mom, and this lady over here." He pointed towards Sarah. The boy turned to her, eyes wide, and said, "You don't look like a superhero." Sarah smiled tightly. "Most don't," she said softly. As the kids gathered around to hear Keanu read Where the Wild Things Are, Sarah took a seat near the back of the room, just out of view. Her fingers trembled slightly. She clenched them into her coat pockets. The pages turned. The voices rose in laughter and awe, and something inside her started to ache. Not with sadness, but exhaustion so deep it scraped the walls of her chest. The last 2 years had been a blur. It wasn't just the long hours. It was the constant forward motion. Flights that left before sunrise, meetings that ran past midnight, foundation galas that required 15 wardrobe changes and 20 diplomatic emails. Keanu never asked her to be everywhere, but somehow she always was. There had been a time when Sarah loved the rhythm. It made her feel vital, purposeful, needed. But now, it felt like a treadmill with no pause button. She hadn't seen her brother in over a year, missed her best friend's wedding, lost touch with her book club. Her calendar had more entries about film screenings and nonprofit launches than about life milestones. And yet she kept going, because each time she considered slowing down, someone else's life stood to benefit from her hustle. A girl needing a new wheelchair, a grieving mother needing flight tickets to attend her son's memorial, A crew member quietly laid off and sent groceries anonymously. Keanu never took credit. Sarah never asked for it. But the cost of kindness was often paid behind the scenes, in hours, in heartbeats, in sacrifices never spoken aloud. Now, sitting in that hospital room, watching a child rest his head against Keanu's shoulder, Sarah felt the weight of all those hidden transactions. She had helped make moments like this possible, but what had it cost her? That night, Sarah returned home to her apartment, flicked on the lights, and was met with silence. A stack of unopened mail sat on the counter. Takeout containers lined the trash. Her bed was still made from 2 days ago. She dropped her bag and sank into the couch, not bothering to change out of her work clothes. She stared at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed, a reminder about an upcoming logistics meeting with a production team in Vancouver. Then another notification, a voice message from her ex. She didn't press play. She didn't need to. She still remembered the last thing he'd said in person. "I love how much you care for him. I just wish you cared for yourself, too." Sarah closed her eyes. The tears didn't come this time, just a hollow quiet. Sleep was no longer rest. When she did manage to doze off, it was shallow, interrupted. She'd wake to phantom alerts, rehearsing schedules in her mind, rewriting emails she never sent. Some days she felt like a ghost, present in the room, absent in herself. She started snapping at people, not Keanu, never him, but drivers, caterers, vendors. Then she'd apologize immediately, voice strained and apologetic. She hated how easily irritation came now. The sharpness in her voice wasn't hers. Once, during a board meeting for the charity, she accidentally scheduled 2 conflicting events for Keanu. It had never happened before. When she realized it, she ran out of the room and locked herself in the restroom stall, heart pounding. She fixed it within 10 minutes. No one ever knew, but she had sat on that tiled floor whispering, "You're slipping," to herself like it was a confession. But still she pushed forward. "I'll take a break after this next event." That phrase had become her promise and her prison. After the charity gala, after the hospital visit, after the film wrap. But after never came, because every time she thought about stepping away, she imagined someone being left behind, a kid not getting their special wish, a foundation partner losing their connection, even Keanu, missing something important because she wasn't there to remind him. And she knew him. He'd never demand it, never guilt her. But that made it worse, because it meant if she broke, it wouldn't be because he asked too much, it would be because she didn't say no. By the fall of 2017, Sarah's smile had become muscle memory. Her calendar was still full, but inside, the lights were starting to dim. The burnout had begun, and no one, not even Keanu, saw it coming. The office was still that night. A rare silence had settled across the Malibu property, the ocean's rhythmic pulse a faint hum beyond the windows. It was past midnight, and most of the lights had been turned off, except for a soft desk lamp in the corner of the bungalow office. Sarah was there, shoulders hunched, eyes red from staring too long at glowing screens. Her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, sending out final confirmations for an upcoming charity gala in Vancouver. Flights were arranged, hotels were secured, dietary needs accommodated. She was in her element, but her body was no longer cooperating. A sharp twinge behind her eyes made her wince. Her hands, which had once moved fluidly between calls and calendars, now trembled slightly as she tried to finish drafting one last logistics update. The screen began to blur. She blinked hard, then again. Her chest felt tight, not with pain, but with something more insidious. Fatigue so deep it had wrapped itself around her bones. A half-empty thermos of black coffee sat at her elbow, cold and untouched for hours. The clock ticked past 1. She checked her phone out of habit, another message from the venue manager, and a missed call from her mother. She didn't even open it. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for just a second. That's when her body gave out. There was no warning, no gasp, no scream, just the soft sound of her body slumping sideways onto the desk, a paperweight clattering to the floor. Her glasses skidded across a stack of printed itineraries. Silence returned. Keanu was walking the grounds that night, something he did when he couldn't sleep. He had just returned from a quiet hospital visit in Santa Barbara and wanted to check that everything was ready for the gala before morning. When he opened the office door and saw her, slumped motionless, with her face half buried in a pile of papers, something in him seized. He rushed forward. "Sarah!" No response. His hands gently shook her shoulder, his voice tight with concern. Hey, wake up! You okay?" She stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering open. It took a moment for her to register where she was. Keanu crouched beside her, his face etched with alarm. "You fainted," he said. "You need to rest. This isn't okay." Sarah blinked at him, dazed. Then she sat up too quickly, instinctively reaching for her laptop. "I'm fine. Just give me a second. I need to send the final email to the Vancouver team. If I don't..." He gently placed a hand over hers, stopping her. "Sarah, no more. Please." But her voice, quiet and hoarse, pushed back. "If I don't do it, no one will. The guest list is still missing the special access notes for the family with the wheelchair. And the AV team? Keanu, you can't afford for this to fall through, not after what this charity means to you." Her eyes, always so sharp and steady, looked glassy. There was panic behind her professionalism, exhaustion threaded with guilt. He hesitated, still kneeling, and for a brief moment, he looked utterly unsure. "Who's going to take care of you?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Her lips parted, then closed again, as if she couldn't quite find the words. She stared down at her hands. Hands that had sent 1,000 emails, booked hundreds of flights, arranged hospital visits, and written condolence notes Keanu never had time to draft. Now they trembled faintly on her lap, exposed and uncertain. "I don't know," she whispered. The air in the office felt different then, no longer filled with the hum of machines or the soft click of a keyboard. It was thick now, with vulnerability, with all the things never said between them. Sarah had always been the fortress, the organizer, the shield. But now, in this quiet hour, that fortress had cracks. Keanu stood slowly, pulling a chair next to hers and sitting beside her. He didn't touch her again, didn't try to fix it. He just sat there, watching her with that deep, reflective calm he was known for, his brow furrowed with quiet worry. "You've been carrying too much," he said finally. Sarah gave a small, humorless laugh. "It's my job." "No," he replied. "Your job is to help, not to disappear." She looked away. Her voice had the edge of something brittle. "I'll take a break. After the gala. I just need to get through this one." Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You said that after the last premiere, and after the Tokyo shoot, and after the memorial visit for Jace's parents. That was 2 years ago." Sarah's eyes welled up, but she blinked hard. "This is different." "Dump. How?" She hesitated. "Because this one matters, huh?" "They all mattered," he said gently. "But so do you." She flinched at that, as if the words hit a place she wasn't ready to confront. For 12 years, her entire identity had been wrapped around service, purpose, being indispensable. If she stopped now, who would she be? There was a long pause, and then she reached for her glasses, placing them carefully back on her face. Her voice steadied, though it was quieter than before. "I'll sleep for a few hours, then I'll finish the prep. I promise." Keanu didn't argue. Maybe he sensed that if he pressed, she'd only dig in deeper. Maybe he knew this wasn't the kind of exhaustion that could be reasoned with. So he stood, moved to the doorway, and looked back once. "I'm serious, Sarah. If you need time, take it." She gave him a small nod, her face already turning back toward the screen. illuminated by the glow of the email drafts. He left without another word. And by morning, she was at her desk again, coffee in hand, schedule aligned, eyes tired but determined. The strongest ones never shouted their breaking point. They whispered it in missed calls, long silences, and the spaces between calendar invites. And she was still moving. The weeks after her collapse moved in a blur. Sarah resumed her pace like nothing had happened, but something had shifted, deep inside beneath the surface of routines and reminders. Her body obeyed, but her spirit lagged. Sleep became fitful. Meals turned into protein bars in the car between events. Conversations with friends dwindled to text bubbles she never replied to. People praised her dedication. "You're a machine," one producer told her during a press tour. Sarah smiled politely. She hated that word. Machines didn't feel. Machines didn't fall apart. She began keeping a bottle of ibuprofen in every bag she owned. One in her purse, one in her desk drawer, another in the glove compartment. Her head throbbed constantly now, especially at night, when the house was too quiet and her thoughts refused to sleep. She'd stare at the ceiling and think about the partner she lost, the birthdays she missed, the hospital waiting rooms she was never in for her own family. And through it all, she kept moving. Keanu didn't bring up that night again, but his eyes lingered on her longer during meetings. He asked if she was okay more often. Each time, she nodded with a practiced ease. "Yes, fine. All good." But there was one evening, after a long charity shoot at a rehab center in Arizona, where her mask slipped. The car ride back to the hotel was quiet. The desert stretched endlessly around them, stars blinking awake in the dusk. Keanu sat beside her in the back seat, scrolling through something on his phone. Then he looked up. "You didn't eat today." Sarah gave a small shrug. "Too busy." He paused. "You know you don't have to prove anything to me." That caught her off guard. She turned to look at him, caught between confusion and fatigue. "I'm not trying to prove anything," she said. Keanu held her gaze. "Are you?" She didn't answer, because deep down she was. Not for praise or approval, but for worth. If she wasn't needed, then what was she? That night, in the hotel room, she stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. Her eyes were sunken. A new line had formed between her brows. She touched it absently, wondering when it arrived. The next morning, she was back at work before sunrise. But something had changed. A faint tremor had started. It lived in her hands, in her smile, in the way she blinked a little slower than before. The breakdown hadn't come in screams or dramatic tears. It came in quiet moments, as moments no one else noticed. Not yet. Sarah knew Keanu Reeves in ways most people never would. To the world, he was a quiet icon, humble, gracious, always kind. But to her, he was something else, utterly human, a man who left his phone in the fridge, forgot where he parked at least once a week, and couldn't keep track of time if his life depended on it. He wasn't careless. He was just trusting. He trusted that someone would be there to hold things together. That someone was always Sarah. It started with little things: a forgotten passport before an international flight, a double-booked interview slot, a missed follow-up on a foundation grant. Each time, Sarah caught the mistake before it could snowball. She memorized the dates he'd forget. She carried a second passport just in case. She learned the rhythm of his thoughts, when he was drifting into one of his quiet spells, when his mind was tangled in grief, when he needed a gentle nudge rather than a calendar reminder. She even learned the exact tone his sister Kim used when she was having a good day versus a bad one. Because every Tuesday, without fail, Sarah would call Kim on Keanu's behalf, pretending it was him when he was too exhausted to speak. Kim always knew, of course. But she appreciated the voice, the effort, the fact that her brother, silent as he often was, had someone who, filled in the blanks of his life. Sarah was never thanked for those calls. She never asked to be. In 2018, Keanu met a boy at a children's cancer hospital during a holiday visit. The boy, named Eli, was shy, barely spoke, but handed Keanu a small origami crane and asked, in a whisper, "Can you send this to the moon?" Keanu had smiled, taken the crane, and whispered back, "I'll do my best." The moment should have ended there, but Sarah noticed how Keanu tucked the crane into his coat pocket, how he stared out the window of the car afterward in silence. 2 weeks later, Eli passed away. His mother sent a message through the hospital, thanking Keanu. She said that in Eli's last hours, he believed his crane was already on its way to the stars. Sarah never told Keanu what she did next. She contacted a small team at a private aerospace company and arranged for a symbolic paper crane, a replica, to be added to a payload scheduled for a low-orbit launch the following spring. It wasn't the moon, but it was close enough. The sobbing widow, and the launch happened. She sent an anonymous letter to Eli's mother. She never told Keanu, not even years later. This was Sarah's other job, the one no one ever saw. She tracked birthdays he forgot, even of people he met only once. A hotel janitor in Prague who'd helped him find a lost bracelet during filming. A barista in Vancouver who had told him, in passing, about her mother's surgery. Sarah made sure those people received handwritten notes or small gifts, always signed by Keanu, but written by her. They thought it was him. Maybe that made it real enough. She told herself it was kindness, a way to multiply goodness without ego. But somewhere deep inside, she wondered if she was erasing herself, bit by bit. One morning, Keanu arrived at a press interview in Tokyo and reached for the question cards Sarah had always prepared. But this time, she hadn't. She'd been up late coordinating a logistics nightmare involving a delayed cargo shipment for a charity event in Brazil. Something had to give. He looked up, puzzled. "Where are the cards?" She smiled and said, "I thought you might want to speak from the heart today." He gave a quiet nod, but she could see the faint worry behind his eyes, the small panic. He wasn't unprepared, just vulnerable without her scaffolding. Afterward, he thanked her and said it had gone well. But the truth was, it hadn't. The interview meandered, and headlines the next day were lukewarm. Sarah took the blame silently. She didn't sleep that night. She was failing at being invisible. In the rare moments Sarah slowed down, it hit her how blurry the lines had become. She wasn't just managing a man's career. She was holding up the architecture of his entire public life, his peace, his rhythm, his image, his soul. There was no resentment in her heart, only fatigue. A fatigue so deep it didn't show in her posture or her speech. It showed in the quiet moments, in how long she stared at a blank screen before writing the next email, in how her smile, once instinctive, now had to be manually switched on, in how often she whispered to herself, "Just one more week." She once joked to a fellow coordinator at a Netflix event, "I'm Keanu's second brain," the woman laughed and said. "Sounds exhausting." Sarah had chuckled too, but something about the words stuck with her. When had she stopped being herself? When had she become just an extension of someone else? She thought back to one particular evening, the kind that didn't make headlines or get captured on fan pages. Keanu had been invited to a private fundraiser hosted by a children's cancer foundation. He was exhausted after back-to-back filming, but Sarah knew he wouldn't cancel. She'd prepped everything, the route, the questions he might be asked, even a list of the children's names and their favorite colors. Keanu showed up quiet, gentle as always, kneeling beside each hospital bed, remembering every name, every detail. But what stuck with her was what happened after. In the parking lot, he leaned against the car and simply stared into the distance. She waited, silent, next to him. After a few minutes, he whispered, "Do you think it really makes a difference?" Sarah didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell him yes, of course it did, that the parents inside would never forget his kindness, that the children had smiled for the first time in days. But what came out instead was, it would make less of a difference if you stopped. He looked at her then, and for the first time in years, she saw how much he leaned on her, not just for logistics or planning, but to keep believing in what he was doing. She nodded, and they got into the car. He didn't speak the entire ride home, but the next day, he sent a donation to the foundation, double what they'd expected. Sarah had made the machine run so smoothly for so long that no one, not even Keanu, saw the engine wearing down. Her mind, once sharp with solutions, was now fogged with emotional fatigue. She had stopped writing in her journal, stopped calling her sister, stopped updating her friends on her life. It was like watching her own name fade from her contacts list. Still, she never said no. She had taken care of everything except herself. From Make-A-Wish surprises to fan mail sorting, from shielding Keanu from burnout to managing calls from his sister Kim, Sarah had kept the light steady. But in doing so, she had slowly dimmed her own. And though she hadn't realized it yet, the quiet decision had already begun forming in her chest. A letter was coming, a goodbye no one expected. The idea came to Keanu during one of their late-night debriefs. They were sitting on his back porch, wrapped in heavy sweaters, the Malibu wind sharp with ocean salt. He had just finished a long press tour, and Sarah had brought him tea, as always. That's when he mentioned a story about a woman from a war-torn village in Eastern Europe who'd survived unspeakable loss and went on to become a teacher for displaced children. He'd read about her years ago. Her resilience haunted him. He wanted to make a film, not for awards, not for studios, but for truth. Sarah listened quietly, knowing this wasn't just another pitch. She'd seen the way Keanu talked when something moved him, and this moved him deeply. He didn't want to fictionalize the story or glamorize the trauma. He wanted to work with real survivors, use real locations, partner with real charities. It would be raw, honest, and unpredictable. He looked at her and said, "But I can't do this without you." It was the same line she had heard before, in 100 different variations, and each time she answered with action. Within a week, Sarah had cleared his schedule for the next 6 months. She reached out to nonprofits specializing in refugee support, trauma education, and ethical storytelling. She mapped out a list of possible shooting locations in countries that still carried the scars of conflict, but were stable enough to host a film crew. But almost immediately, complications stacked like bricks. Filming permits in the Balkans required exhaustive paperwork and in-person interviews. Translators had to be vetted not only for accuracy, but also for their ability to handle emotional subject matter. Health protocols from the pandemic era were still lingering in many of these regions, adding another layer of bureaucracy. And the charities? While willing, each came with their own guidelines, expectations, and ethical frameworks. Sarah juggled all of it, from early morning Zoom calls with international contacts to late-night script revisions and timeline updates. Her world narrowed to a laptop screen, a blinking inbox, and a spreadsheet of obstacles. She built a calendar that looked like a war map, color-coded stress zones marking flight deadlines, grant windows, and visa appointments. Her phone was always charging, yet never full. And through it all, Keanu kept his quiet faith in her. He would say things like, "We're doing something good," and she'd nod, trying to believe it. But the pressure mounted. Every win came with a cost. Every solved problem revealed 3 more. She started skipping meals without noticing. Her messages to family grew shorter. She hadn't seen her brother in months. When he sent her an ultrasound of his newborn daughter, she replied with a single heart emoji. He didn't even remember doing it. By the 3rd month of pre-production, Sarah's days had blurred into an endless loop. She began waking up in hotel rooms, momentarily unsure of which country she was in. One day it was Warsaw, the next, Sofia, then Sarajevo. Each location came with its own string of meetings, each room filled with people waiting for decisions she hadn't yet had time to make. The project had become a living organism, one that breathed, demanded, and devoured everything in its path. Keanu remained emotionally centered, as he always did, but even he was overwhelmed by the number of moving parts. While he met with survivors and listened to their stories with the patience of a monk, it was Sarah who laid the groundwork. She coordinated schedules for interviews, vetted cultural consultants, and created a crisis management protocol in case anything went wrong during filming. One evening, after reviewing translator contracts in a dim airport lounge, Sarah pulled out her phone and noticed a missed call from her mother, then another from her sister, and a message that simply read, "She's here, 6LB90s. You're an aunt now." She stared at the photo attached to the message, a tiny hand wrapped around her sister's finger, both of them glowing under fluorescent hospital lights. Sarah closed her eyes. The silence hit harder than expected. Her niece had been born, and she hadn't even remembered the due date. She hadn't returned her sister's last message, which had said, "Hope you'll be around this time." She thought of calling right then, but her gate was already boarding. The film crew was waiting in Tirana, and one of the charities had pushed up a critical site visit. She slipped her phone back into her bag, promised herself she'd call tomorrow, and walked toward the gate. At night, alone in her hotel room, Sarah opened the latest production draft. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trying to fix a grant clause that had just been flagged. But the words blurred. A tear slipped down her cheek before she even realized she was crying. Not loud sobs, just a quiet, exhausted release, like the body acknowledging a truth the mind had refused to say out loud. She had missed another moment she could never get back. And still, the work kept coming. By the final stretch of the project, Sarah was running on fumes. Coffee no longer kept her alert, and even adrenaline had stopped doing its job. Her planner, usually pristine, was now scribbled with corrections, reminders, and sticky notes in 3 languages. She rarely slept more than 3 hours at a time. Every deadline felt like a cliff edge. Every small request, a costume approval, a dietary restriction on set, a last-minute press question, was a mountain she had to climb without rope. One morning, while coordinating a conference call between producers in Los Angeles, field officers in Croatia, and an NGO contact in Nairobi, her internet dropped in the middle of the negotiation. She sat there, frozen, staring at the blinking router light. She didn't panic. She didn't curse. She just sat there, breathing deeply, feeling completely hollow. In the silence, the forgotten messages came back. The voicemail from her sister saying, "I hope she grows up to be even half as strong as you." The email from her mother asking, "Can we plan a video call? I know you're busy, but she's already turning 1 month." All unopened. All unanswered. She thought of the woman the film was about, a war survivor turned teacher, whose quiet dignity had moved Keanu so deeply. Sarah respected her too. But now, after months of telling her story, she felt something unexpected. Resentment. Not toward the woman, but toward the way her story had taken over Sarah's life. The cause was noble, the mission worthy. But no one had asked what Sarah had to give up to tell it. Even Keanu didn't know the full weight. He thanked her after every major breakthrough, sent her notes of appreciation, even hugged her once and said, "You're the reason this works." But none of that filled the emptiness that had grown inside her. A space left behind by missed birthdays, forgotten promises, and moments she would never get back. The night before the final cut of the film was approved, Sarah stood in her hotel room, staring at the city skyline outside. She picked up her phone, opened her gallery, and found the photo of her niece from the day she was born. She whispered, "I'm sorry." Then she put her phone down, turned off the light, and sat alone in the dark, listening to her heartbeat. It was the first time in weeks she wasn't moving, planning, fixing, or coordinating. It was also the first time she realized something had broken in her, and she wasn't sure if she'd ever get it back. The cursor blinked against a blank screen. Sarah sat in her home office, the same one where she used to organize every tour, appearance, and charity event Keanu had committed to over the past decade. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, unsure whether they were trembling from fatigue or fear. It was January 2022, the start of a new year, and yet nothing about her life felt new. It felt like the same treadmill, endlessly spinning. She had poured herself a glass of water and sat down, hours earlier, with the intention to write a resignation letter. A clean, respectful, thoughtful goodbye. One that would honor everything she and Keanu had built, without resentment. One that wouldn't hurt him. But every time she typed, "Dear Keanu," the words stopped. Her throat would tighten, and she would hit backspace, again and again. On her screen now were only those two words, "Dear Keanu." She looked around the room. On the walls were little reminders of her work. A framed photo of Keanu standing with a child leukemia survivor in Toronto. A thank you card from a single mother whose rent they had secretly paid after a random encounter in a bookstore. And in the corner, the leather-bound journal Keanu had gifted her during their 5th year working together, embossed with her initials and still mostly blank. For the first time, she asked herself why she had never used it. Sarah's assistant, Maya, had noticed her drifting lately. Maya was sharp, kind, and unusually intuitive for someone 10 years younger. She had come on board during the production chaos of the teacher film in 2021 and quietly taken on more and more responsibility. A week earlier, Maya had dropped by Sarah's apartment with pastries and asked, "Are you okay?" Sarah had smiled, polished as ever. "Of course, just tired." Maya didn't buy it. She sat across from her, let the silence stretch, then said softly, "You know, you don't have to keep being everyone's glue." Sarah had laughed. "That's kind of my job, Maya." "No, it's not," Maya said gently. "Your job was to coordinate, organize, protect." But at some point it turned into something else. Sarah folded her arms. "Like what?" "Like disappearing into someone else's life so completely that you forgot your own." That landed harder than Sarah expected. She had waved Maya off with a smile, but later that night those words had echoed until dawn. And now, here she was, blinking at the screen, unable to put into words what 12 years of her life had really meant and why it suddenly felt like too much. Her phone buzzed, a message from Maya. Just 3 words. "You okay today?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She stared at the text, heart heavy, and thought, not for the first time, maybe I don't know what okay feels like anymore. Later that evening, Sarah stepped outside for air. The breeze off the Pacific was cool, laced with salt and memory. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from the cold, but from something deeper. A hollowness that had settled into her chest like an unwanted guest. Her phone was still in her pocket, Maya's message unopened now for hours. She hadn't written the letter, but it sat in her mind, fully formed. It would have said something like, "Keanu, I want you to know first that working with you changed my life. You've taught me kindness without spectacle, humility in success, and strength in silence. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being someone who had a life of her own, and I need to figure out how to become that person again." It wasn't anger she felt. It wasn't bitterness. It was a quiet unraveling, a soft recognition that her devotion had gone too far, and that in loving her work she had forgotten her worth outside of it. She heard the ocean crashing below the cliffside and remembered the first time she saw Keanu cry. It had been in 2015. They were in a hospital in Ohio, visiting a young boy with terminal cancer who had requested to see Neo one last time. The boy was barely 10. Keanu had brought gifts, stayed for hours, held the child's hand while the machines beeped steadily behind him. When they left, Keanu sat in the car in silence. Sarah said nothing, just waited. Then, out of nowhere, he whispered, It's not fair. She turned to him. What isn't? He shook his head. That he won't get to grow up. That people forget how precious time is. Sarah had nodded. You remind them. But the truth was, she hadn't reminded herself. Not once had she stopped long enough to ask if her time, her short, irretrievable years, were being lived for her. Back inside, she made tea, stood by the counter as it steeped, and pulled out her journal, the same one Keanu had given her. She opened to the first page. Instead of writing the resignation letter on her laptop, she started something different by hand. The ink glided smoothly, more honest than she expected. Who am I when I'm not the one fixing things? She paused, the question staring back at her like a stranger. For years, she had been the quiet rhythm behind Keanu's carefully constructed world, his sanctuary keeper, the protector of his peace. But now, she needed to find her own. The next morning, Sarah showed up a little later than usual. The team barely noticed. She always blended into the background, orchestrating everything while staying invisible. She sat at her desk, pretending to scroll through emails. But really, she was rereading what she had written in her journal the night before. Maya appeared in the doorway with 2 coffees. Thought you could use this, she said, placing one gently beside Sarah's hand. Sarah looked up, her eyes a little red. Thank you. Maya hesitated. You know, it's okay to want more. It doesn't make you ungrateful. Sarah smiled faintly. That's the thing. I don't want more. I want something else. Something that feels like me. Maya nodded. Then go find it. The words settled like a whisper across Sarah's shoulders. Go find it. She turned to her screen, pulled up the resignation letter again, and read it line by line. It was direct, kind, and laced with the honesty she hadn't allowed herself before, but still, her finger hovered over the delete button. Not yet. She closed the file and opened a new one. She didn't title it, just began typing from a blank page. Us to quit. Not yet, but to start. She made a list of what she'd forgotten. Her niece's name day, her mother's last surgery, the canceled weekend writing retreat she'd once dreamed of, the script she started 10 years ago and never touched again, the version of herself that had drifted out of view. The door opened softly. Keanu stepped in, his shoulders a little slouched from the weight of travel and another emotional visit to a veterans shelter. He glanced at Sarah, then did a double take. You okay? He asked gently. She nodded. I will be. It wasn't a moment of dramatic revelation, just 2 people who had shared a lifetime's worth of trust, sitting in a moment of honesty. Keanu reached for his notes on the table, but not before hesitating. Hey, if you ever want to, I don't know, take some real time off, you should. Sarah looked at him. Thanks. But she knew then it wouldn't be time off. It would be goodbye. Not out of resentment, out of love for what she had given and what she still hoped to become. And when the time came, she would write a final letter. Not one written in burnout or grief, but in question. That letter would sit quietly on a desk one morning, sealed in a cream-colored envelope with his name in her neat handwriting. Sarah's phone buzzed softly just past noon on a Monday, the kind of afternoon where the world outside the office window looked so still it felt like time had stopped. She picked it up instinctively, scrolling through notifications before one caught her eye. Voicemail from Patricia Reeves, Keanu's mother. She pressed play, already knowing the tone she'd hear. Patricia had that graceful way of asking without ever sounding demanding. Hi, sweetheart, the message began. Just wanted to touch base. I know you've probably already started planning something for next week, but I thought I'd confirm. Keanu did mention my birthday, right? Sarah smiled faintly. Of course he had. He always remembered his mother's birthday, but rarely the details. The past few years, it was Sarah who booked the florist, arranged the discreet beach dinner, and ensured the right playlist was queued up. Patricia adored Chopin played on cello. She opened her planner, already a mess of sticky notes and scribbles. In bold black pen, Patricia, 75th, was circled with triple underlines. Beneath it, she'd penciled in gift ideas: an antique silver locket, a signed copy of an old poetry book, maybe something custom from that boutique in Big Sur Patricia loved. Sarah got to work immediately. She called the caterer, confirmed dietary restrictions, arranged transport, checked weather patterns, and even reserved an ocean view table at a quiet restaurant Keanu and Patricia had visited 10 years earlier. She selected a handmade card from a box she kept just for occasions like these and pressed a violet petal between its folds. By the time it was 6:00 p.m., the plan was flawless. The kind of celebration that would feel effortless to everyone attending. The kind that left people feeling loved without knowing how much went into making it all feel natural. She leaned back in her chair and finally exhaled. And then it hit her. Something else. Another date. Something in her body stirred. That quiet twinge in the back of the mind that whispers when you've forgotten something important. She opened her digital calendar, flipping to next week. And there it was. A name. Faint, almost hidden behind overlapping reminders and meetings. Mom, 70th. Not even in bold, not even underlined, just sitting there, buried under a dozen events and tasks related to Keanu's foundation fundraiser. Sarah froze. She stared at the entry, heart dropping slowly like a weight descending into deep water. Her mother's 70th birthday, the same day as Patricia's. Not only had she forgotten to plan anything, she hadn't even called, hadn't texted. She hadn't even remembered it was coming. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands. It was already after 6:30 p.m., too late for a dinner, too late to pretend she had something planned all along. Her thumb hovered over her mother's name in the favorites list. For the first time in years, she hesitated. She finally tapped call. It rang, only once. Hello? Her mother's voice was soft, gentle as ever, no trace of anger. That made it worse. Hi, Mom, Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. I'm so sorry I didn't call earlier. I just saw the reminder. I got caught up with work. There was a pause, a long one. Then her mother replied, It's okay, sweetheart. I didn't expect you anyway. The words weren't said with bitterness. They weren't a jab or a guilt trip. They were simply honest. And that was what shattered Sarah. I didn't expect you anyway. Sarah's eyes welled instantly. She stood from her desk and walked to the window, the phone still pressed to her ear, staring out into the Malibu dusk. The Pacific shimmered gold and indigo in the distance, a view her mother had never seen, a home she had never been invited to. I should have called. I should have been there, Sarah whispered, voice thick. You're doing so much for so many people, Sarah, her mother said kindly. You've always been that way, ever since you were little. But I'm your daughter, and you're still that too, her mother said, with a quiet strength that only mothers seem to carry. I'm proud of you. I always have been. But I miss you. And not just on birthdays. Sarah didn't reply. She couldn't. Her throat clenched around 1,000 things she wanted to say. I love you. I'm sorry. I don't know how I became a ghost in my own family. But the words sat frozen. Her mother filled the silence with grace. Well, she said, the garden looks beautiful this year. The daffodils came up early. I thought of you when they did. Sarah closed her eyes. I miss you too, she finally whispered. They ended the call gently. No drama, no fireworks, just a quiet ache. A space left open by years of late nights, early mornings, and never-ending to-do lists for someone else's life. Sarah sat at her desk long after the call ended. The violet card she'd picked out for Patricia still sat unopened beside her keyboard. It looked beautiful, elegant. But suddenly, it felt like it belonged to another life. A life she had curated but never lived. She pulled out her laptop and opened a blank document. She stared at the screen. The cursor blinked. Waiting. She typed the words slowly. "Dear Keanu." She paused. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Then she closed the laptop. Not tonight. The letter would not come that night. But the choice had already been made. Somewhere deep inside her, beneath the endless deadlines, beneath the tidy to-do lists and unread birthday reminders, something had finally shifted. Sarah didn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of waves crashing against the Malibu cliffs. Every so often, the wind knocked against the window pane. But her mind wasn't in Malibu anymore. It was back in San Jose, at a small kitchen table with yellow chairs, where her mother used to pour her orange juice every morning before school. She remembered her mother's hands, always moving, always working. The same hands that had packed her lunches, paid the bills, clipped coupons, ironed dresses, and later helped fold programs for her college graduation. They were strong hands. But now, Sarah hadn't held them in months. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the office an hour earlier than usual. She walked in carrying two things: a coffee she barely touched, and the decision she had postponed for over a year. By 8 o'clock IEM, she was alone. No assistants, no deliveries. Just the quiet hum of the fridge in the break room and the faint buzz of electricity from the lights above. She opened her laptop again. This time, she didn't hesitate. The letter poured out of her, word by word, like breath she'd been holding for too long. It wasn't angry. It wasn't resentful. If anything, it was soft. A love letter in disguise. Gratitude wrapped around exhaustion. Truth woven gently through kindness. She wrote about the years she'd been honored to serve beside him, about the moments she was proud of, moments the world would never see. The sick children whose days had been brightened because of a quick flight she arranged. The veterans who received hand-delivered donations. The mothers who cried quietly backstage after Keanu surprised them with scholarships for their kids. She wrote about the pride she felt watching Keanu become not just a movie star, but a human being who still cared. But she also wrote about herself, about the birthdays she missed, the family she grew distant from, the nights she fell asleep fully dressed because the bed was closer than the closet, and about how somewhere along the way her name had slipped quietly out of her own life. When she was done, she signed the bottom, simply, "With gratitude and grace, Sarah." She printed the letter, placed it inside a thick, cream-colored envelope and sealed it. No return address. Just one word written carefully on the front: Keanu. As the morning sun crept through the window and brushed across the desk, where she had built 12 years of quiet, invisible legacy, Sarah placed the letter at its center. This time there was no doubt, no cursor blinking, no voice in her head asking, "Are you sure?" She was. When she walked out of the bungalow for the last time, she didn't look back. The sun had just begun to rise over the hills of Malibu, casting a quiet golden glow across the coastline. Keanu's black Porsche rolled slowly down the gravel path toward the bungalow, a place that had always felt like both a command center and a sanctuary. He was running behind, which was unusual. He hadn't slept much. A script had kept him up all night, but he wasn't sure if that's what had really disturbed his sleep. As he approached the front door, a strange stillness hung in the air. The usual morning rhythms were missing. No faint tapping of keys from inside. No clink of ceramic from the coffee mugs Sarah always had waiting for him. No quiet, "Morning, Keanu," that usually came without fail, no matter how early or how late. He stepped into the office, silent. No lights on, no soft music playing from Sarah's playlist. Just the morning sun slipping through the blinds and landing on the surface of the large oak desk. Then he saw it. A cream-colored envelope centered on the desk. One word on the front, handwritten in calm, slanted letters: Keanu. He stared at it for a long moment. His throat tightened. He didn't move right away. Something inside him braced itself. Finally, he stepped forward and picked it up. The envelope was unsealed but neatly pressed. He opened it, slowly pulling out the single folded page inside. The paper was heavy, textured, the kind Sarah always bought in bulk for thank you notes and foundation letters. This time, the words were for him. He unfolded the page and began to read. By the time he reached the second sentence, he had lowered himself into the leather chair behind the desk. The same chair she used to spin slightly when she was deep in thought, chewing on the cap of a pen or muttering reminders under her breath. His breath caught at the first paragraph. Dear Keanu, I never planned to write this. I always thought I'd keep going. Just one more project, one more month, one more reason to stay. But something shifted, and I realized I couldn't keep giving from a cup that's been empty for years. He closed his eyes. The words weren't bitter. They didn't blame him. But they landed like small, precise weights, revealing a truth he had never truly seen. Or maybe had chosen not to. You taught me how to care deeply, it read. You reminded me that stillness and compassion can exist even in a world that demands everything from us. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to care for myself. I lost my voice in the quiet between your needs and everyone. Keanu's hand trembled slightly. He read on. Keanu leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, the letter trembling just slightly between his fingers. His mind reached back, scanning over the years like flipping through a photo album of moments he hadn't fully understood at the time. How many times had Sarah covered for him when he was overwhelmed? How many travel arrangements, foundation meetings, charity calls, personal favors had she juggled without complaint? The plane tickets that magically appeared when his schedule changed last minute. The private moments he thought no one noticed, preserved by her thoughtful shielding. The stories he read to children in hospitals. She had arranged every visit, every detail, and yet he had never asked how she was holding up. His eyes moved back to the page. I stayed because I believed in the work, in the quiet kindnesses we were building together. But kindness without balance becomes a burden, and I didn't know how to set boundaries when I admired you so much. He exhaled slowly. On the far wall, an old photograph of the two of them together leaned slightly to the left, inside its frame. It had been taken at a quiet fundraiser. Sarah was barely smiling, her eyes tired, but she stood just behind him, always one step back, as if to hold the space without claiming it. She never wanted recognition, he whispered aloud. That made the ache sharper. The letter continued. I missed my father's final surgery. I missed my niece's birth. I forgot my own mother's birthday. But I remembered the names of every child who got a grant because of our foundation. I remembered your sister's favorite tea. I remembered to double-check every contract and scout every location. I remembered everything for you. Except myself. Keanu pressed his fingers to his temple. He couldn't tell if the sting behind his eyes was from lack of sleep or the quiet guilt rising like a tide in his chest. He stood and paced the room. The envelope was still on the desk. The chair she always used was empty, the faint indent still on the cushion. For the first time in years, the room felt wrong, out of rhythm, disoriented. She never said anything, he murmured. He thought of the night he'd found her asleep at her desk, head down, glasses pushed into her hair. He'd told her to rest. She'd brushed it off. Who will take care of everything? Now he knew what that really meant. It wasn't just about the job. It was about identity, about someone who had built her life around caretaking so thoroughly she didn't know how to stop. He looked back down at the letter, turning to the second half with a trembling breath. The final portion of the letter was softer, less structured, like Sarah had let herself write freely without the usual perfection. I don't leave with resentment, I leave with gratitude. You gave me a front row seat to decency in a world that's often loud and self-serving. You reminded me that small gestures matter, like handwritten notes to strangers. The quiet way you check in on your sister, the way you listen more than you speak." Keanu's throat tightened. "But now, I need to figure out who I am when no one needs me. I need to stop being a background character in my own life." The words hit harder than any criticism ever could. For all his humility and gentleness, Keanu had relied on the silence, on Sarah's quiet competence, on her never saying no. And now, in her goodbye, she was showing him something more honest than any conversation they'd ever had. "I hope, one day, I find something that makes me feel as purposeful as this job did. But I also hope it doesn't cost me the same things." There was no signature. Just one final line, handwritten in the bottom margin, separate from the rest. "Thank you for trusting me. It meant more than you ever knew." Keanu sat still for a long time. The room buzzed with that odd hum silence makes when it's too loud to ignore. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting warm stripes through the blinds across the floor. The world was already moving. Meetings were probably waiting, emails piling up, but none of it mattered in that moment. He reached for his phone, instinctively wanting to text her. But he didn't. Not yet. Anything he wrote would feel too small, too rushed, too late. Instead, he set the letter down, smoothing the paper with his hand. He took a deep breath, then walked to the window. The garden Sarah had helped plant was in bloom. Roses, hydrangeas, lavender. He hadn't noticed them in weeks. As he stood there, the last line of her letter replayed in his mind, again and again. "Thank you for trusting me." The trust had always been mutual. He just hadn't realized how much it had cost her to hold it all together. Now, she was gone, and for the first time in 12 years, Keanu Reeves wasn't sure what came next. The morning moved differently without her. Keanu arrived at the studio later than usual, his eyes shadowed by a weight he couldn't quite name. The usual rhythm of his day had cracked, but the break was almost imperceptible, like a fine hairline fracture no one saw until it splintered the whole frame. He paused at the entrance of the office. Her coffee wasn't there. The jasmine green tea, steeped just the way he liked it, always sat to the right of his desk. A quiet ritual. Today the desk was bare. His eyes flicked to the corner where her laptop usually rested. Gone. The small vase with dried lavender she'd brought back from a trip to Provence had disappeared too. He reached for his phone and called her. Straight to voicemail. He hung up, tried again. Same. His fingers hovered for a moment, then he sent a quick text. "You okay?" He waited a moment longer before calling Maya. No response. Back inside, he wandered through the studio space. Crew members bustled around in casual chatter, none of them realizing the silence that had crept into the building had nothing to do with sound. It was an absence. A presence that had always existed just below the surface, now pulled away. He walked into the back room, the editing suite where Sarah often worked late nights. Empty. On the floor, near the power strip, was a hair tie. One of Sarah's, the plain black kind she wore wrapped around her wrist more often than in her hair. He bent down, picked it up, and turned it over in his fingers. He set it on the table gently, like it was something fragile. He called Maya again. Still nothing. That evening, Keanu drove home slower than usual, windows down, wind brushing through the cabin of his old black SUV. His dog Harley sat in the passenger seat, ears flapping slightly. Keanu kept one hand on the wheel and the other gently resting on Harley's head. When they got home, Keanu didn't go inside. Instead, he walked down the familiar path toward the beach. The sky was just starting to lose its light, streaked with watercolor strokes of orange and pale blue. Harley trotted beside him, tail wagging lazily, occasionally sniffing the sea air. They reached the sand. Keanu didn't sit, he just stood, staring at the horizon. Harley sat beside him, then looked up with expectant eyes. This was the part of the evening when they usually turned back, headed to the small studio space where Sarah would be waiting with a to-do list and a slight smirk. But there was no studio tonight. No voice calling out, "You're late, but I adjusted the timeline." Just the hush of the waves. Keanu whispered, more to himself than to the dog. "I should have seen it coming." The next morning he called again. Still voicemail. He scrolled through old messages, looking for something, anything, that might hint at where she'd gone. But Sarah never overshared. She didn't leave trails. Her texts were always efficient, precise. Logistics, confirmations, times, dates. Lunch rescheduled to 1:30. Your mother's flight is delayed. Kim's favorite flowers are en route. He stared at one from 3 months ago. Just 3 words. "I'll handle it." Keanu leaned back in his chair, pressing his thumb and forefinger into his eyes. The letter still sat on the desk beside him. He hadn't moved it. He couldn't. Reading it once had felt like enough to knock the wind from his chest. A second time felt like opening a wound before it even had the dignity to scar. He tried Maya again. This time, she answered. Her voice was cautious. "Hey, Keanu, is she okay?" he asked, skipping any greeting. He paused. "She's safe. She just needed space," Maya said. She didn't want to disappear. She just couldn't stay. "Where is she?" "D. I promised I wouldn't say." The line stayed quiet for a moment. Then Maya added, "It wasn't about you. Not entirely. It was about everything." Keanu exhaled slowly. "I didn't see it." He didn't want you to." He looked out the window. The studio garden was overgrown in parts. Sarah usually reminded him to call the landscaper. He almost said, "Almost," asked when she was coming back. But he didn't. Instead, he thanked Maya and ended the call. Later that evening, Keanu drove again, but not to the studio, not to a meeting or a reading or any of the places Sarah used to steer him toward. He just drove. No destination, just movement. As if the road might unfold a direction. He passed the bookstore Sarah once loved, a tiny independent shop with creaky floors and a stubborn cat named Olive. He remembered her telling the owner to order a copy of a rare book Keanu had casually mentioned in passing. He'd found it on his desk 2 days later. Back then, he hadn't questioned how it got there. Now he knew. He parked the car, got out and walked to the beach again. Harley stayed in the back seat this time, resting his chin on the edge of the window. Keanu stood at the shore until night swallowed the light. He didn't say a word, but he carried her absence like a weight no one else could see. The next day, Keanu walked into the office out of habit. It was still early, barely past sunrise, but something felt off. The lights were dim, the air still, the rhythm broken. Sarah always lit the citrus-scented candle near the window, always cracked the blinds just enough for morning light to touch the edge of the floor, always left a single sticky note on the whiteboard with a small, scribbled reminder or a smiley face drawn with a shaky hand when she was tired. Now the board was blank, the candle unlit. He reached for the mug she always placed by the espresso machine, black, chipped on the handle, the one she insisted was lucky because it never leaked on his scripts. It wasn't there. The silence stretched long. He wandered through the small space, stopping near her desk. For 12 years, it had been meticulously kept. Organized chaos she alone understood. Colored paperclips in tiny tins, sticky notes with cryptic abbreviations only she and Maya deciphered. A drawer that held both pain relievers and breath mints. Now it looked like a ghost's station. There was no drama in her exit, no slammed doors or shouting, just stillness. He pulled open one drawer and saw a photo tucked in the back. It was worn at the edges. Sarah and her mother, years ago, sitting on a wooden bench, both smiling at something off camera. She looked younger, freer. There was no schedule in her hand, no exhaustion in her shoulders, just joy. He placed the photo back carefully. That evening, he returned to the beach. The tide was out. revealing broken shells and jagged stones beneath the wet sand. Harley followed close, occasionally bumping into his calf, as if nudging him back toward routine. But Keanu kept walking. When the sun finally dipped below the edge of the world, casting the sky in watercolor purples and soft golds, he whispered under his breath, just loud enough for the wind to carry it. I should have asked how she was, not just what was next. A wave came in, rushing around his feet, cold and unexpected. He didn't move. Behind him, the lights of Malibu flickered to life. But he stayed in the dark. For the first time in years, he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, and for once there was no one to tell him. Maya stepped into the quiet office, her footsteps muffled by the thick rug that had become almost invisible under the rhythm of routine. It was the first time she'd been there alone. The scent of coffee, usually subtle in the corners, had faded. The hum of the mini-fridge, the soft buzz of Sarah's favorite pen tapping against the desk, gone. In their place was stillness. She took a deep breath and moved toward Sarah's workstation. The desktop was spotless, not abandoned, just complete. A pale jewel folder sat centered, labeled in Sarah's exact handwriting, Transition Notes. Beside it was a flash drive in a velvet pouch, the same kind she used to store sensitive documents. Maya opened the folder. Inside was an index of every ongoing project, contact list, calendar log, pending deadlines, and personal notes tailored to each task. The precision was surgical. Every task Sarah had handled for Keanu was recorded with timestamps, backup options, and alternative vendor contacts. There were email drafts prepared for events 6 months out, handwritten thank you notes ready to be mailed for charities Keanu supported, even personalized birthday reminders for people Keanu might not remember until the day of. Maya blinked, her throat tightening. She had known Sarah was meticulous, but this was devotion in a language only a few understood. It was more than organization. It was legacy curation. And behind it all, the invisible hours, the choices, the quiet sacrifices. She walked over to Keanu's side of the office. He was already there, sitting in the reading chair with a legal pad resting on his knees. The letter still sat open beside him, but now he held the folder Sarah had prepared. His hands moved through the papers slowly, reverently, as if each page held a piece of truth he'd failed to see until now. Keanu didn't speak when Maya entered. He didn't have to. She knelt beside the chair and whispered, "She left everything covered. Everything." He gave the smallest nod, eyes unreadable. Then he placed the last page of the folder down and looked out toward the window, where the ocean waves were beginning to rise with the afternoon wind. "She always did," he said quietly, "even when we weren't watching." Maya didn't know what to say next, so she remained beside him in silence. They sat like that for a while, two people finally beginning to see the cost of loyalty, not in what was said or done, but in what was never acknowledged. The meetings that ran too long, the dinners skipped, the grief swallowed, the moments lost while making sure someone else never missed theirs. And somewhere, between the unopened emails and flawless spreadsheets, the truth lingered. Sarah hadn't just run a career. She had protected a purpose, one that belonged to a man the world knew, but only because she made sure he showed up. Whole, grounded, on time, always. The next morning, Keanu arrived early. He didn't say much, just walked straight to the table where Sarah's folder still waited. He pulled out the flash drive, plugged it into his laptop, and watched a neatly organized system come to life on the screen. Every project had its own folder. Inside each folder were timelines, updates, risks, even notes in parentheses like, "Keanu might want to call this person personally," or "Remind him gently, this anniversary still stings." He scrolled slowly, more than once pausing and leaning back in his chair, letting the weight of it settle. She had anticipated every gap, every drop, every moment where the future might wobble without her. That afternoon, Maya joined him again. She had spent the night reviewing Sarah's transition notes on the charity partnerships. She looked stunned. "Keanu," she said gently, "do you know how many times she caught mistakes before they reached you? Travel issues, customs holds on gear, venue switches. She didn't just manage things. She intercepted chaos." Keanu didn't look up. "I never saw it. Not all of it. He didn't want you to." Maya placed a small stack of printed emails on the desk. "This one's from 2020, your humanitarian awards speech. You didn't know the teleprompter failed last minute. Sarah hand-wrote your lines in a font that matched the display and fed them in from backstage. You never noticed the difference." Keanu exhaled sharply, an unsteady mix of awe and shame. He stood, walked to the window again, and pressed a palm to the cool glass. The ocean stretched out, steady and unbothered. Unlike him. "She made us so much," he murmured, "and I never asked if she was okay. Not really." Behind him, Maya hesitated. "She loved working with you. That was never the issue." "No," he said, shaking his head. "The issue was that I let love for the work blind me to the person doing it." There was a long pause. Then he added, "She never missed my sister's checkups. She reminded me of every anniversary. She helped me find the right words when I didn't have them, and I never, not once, asked her about her own family." Maya finally sat down across from him. She used to say, "I'm just part of the engine. As long as he's still moving, I'm doing my job." Keanu stared at the floor. But even engines overheat. He walked over to the desk and slowly picked up Sarah's letter again. He didn't reread it. He had memorized every line. But he ran his finger over the paper, like it might say something new if touched softly enough. "I should have seen it coming," he said. The little silences, the smiles that didn't quite reach, the time she said she was fine but her voice was thinner than usual. Maya stood too, suddenly emotional. "Keanu, there's something else." She retrieved a second envelope from her purse. It was smaller, less formal. On the front it simply read, "Maya, in case you're the one who finds this." Keanu stepped back instinctively, watching as she opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Maya read aloud. "If you're reading this, it means I finally did it. I hope you're not mad. You're going to be brilliant. Because you've already done more than you think. Keep protecting the soul of the work, not just the schedule. That's the part that matters. Thank you for being my mirror, especially when I couldn't see myself." Maya folded the letter with trembling fingers. Keanu sat down again, slower this time. Not from exhaustion, but reverence. "He saw everything," he whispered. "Even the moment we'd fall apart without her." And for the first time in 12 years, he realized that loyalty wasn't quiet submission. It was fierce, strategic. And sometimes the truest kind leaves without applause. Only a map no one realizes they'll need until it's already too late. The call came on a quiet Sunday morning, just after sunrise. Keanu had been sitting on the back porch, a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside him. The ocean waves moved with the kind of rhythm that used to calm him. But lately, nothing did. He hadn't been himself since she left. He hadn't really understood how much of his life depended on Sarah's quiet strength until it was gone. His phone buzzed once, then again. Unknown number. He stared at it. Something in his chest shifted. He answered without saying a word. For a few long seconds, there was only the soft hum of the line. Then her voice came through, careful but steady. "Hi, Keanu. It's me." He closed his eyes. Relief moved through him like a wave, but still he didn't speak. Not right away. Part of him was afraid that if he opened his mouth, the moment would shatter. "I'm okay," Sarah said gently. "I needed time. I needed quiet. I should have called sooner." "I know that." His voice finally emerged, low and rough from disuse. "You don't have to explain." There was a pause. On both ends, words rose and fell, unspoken. She filled the silence first. "I'm in Oregon," she said, "staying with my cousin. We're building something small, a mentorship program for young women who aged out of foster care. I've been wanting to do this for years, just never made time." Keanu's throat tightened. He tried to picture her there, not hunched over two laptops at a production table, not racing through a crowded set with a clipboard and a phone pressed to her ear, but in a quiet community hall, listening, guiding, smiling. He finally managed to speak. "You're missed," he said. "I didn't realize how much until you weren't here." Her laugh was soft. "I didn't realize how tired I was until I stopped running." There was affection in her tone, but no apology. No guilt, just truth. "I kept wondering if I abandoned you," she said. "But then I remembered. You never asked me to disappear for you. I chose that." He nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see. "I know. And I never said thank you the way I should have. Not just for the work, for holding so much." Silence again. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was honest. The wind picked up outside as Keanu leaned back into his chair, still holding the phone against his ear like it was something fragile. Sarah's voice had returned, so naturally, yet everything about it felt changed. Lighter, somehow, as if she'd finally laid down the invisible weight she'd carried for years. "Do you remember that charity gala in Vancouver?" she asked suddenly. He smiled. "The one where the power went out, mid-auction?" "Yeah. And you ended up lighting candles and playing piano while I rewrote the donor list by hand." He laughed softly. "You saved the night." I used to think moments like that were the point. That if I could hold everything together in the chaos, maybe I was doing something meaningful. But now, I'm starting to believe meaning can come in the quiet, too. In helping one person at a time. Keanu let that settle in. "I think you're right." She paused. "I'm still figuring it out. I don't know exactly what I want next, but I know I need to live a life that belongs to me, not just to someone else's dream, no matter how worthy." He closed his eyes again, this time not from sorrow, but from understanding. "You deserve that life, Sarah. You always did." For the first time since her voice had appeared in his ear, he felt his shoulders loosen. There was no dramatic resolution, no apology needed, just the quiet recognition between two people who had shared more than 12 years of life, trust, and unspoken sacrifice. "I didn't leave because I stopped believing in your mission," Sarah said gently. "I left because I finally realized I have one of my own." He nodded again, voice softer. "I hope you build something beautiful. I hope you keep doing the same." They sat in silence for another moment. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt full. Like everything that hadn't been said in the letter had somehow been heard in the space between them. "I'm glad you answered," she said. "I always will." And with that, Sarah said goodbye. Not forever, just for now. Keanu stayed on the porch long after the call ended. The phone rested in his palm, the screen dimmed. His coffee had gone cold, but for the first time in weeks, his heart felt warm. Sarah hadn't vanished. She'd stepped into her own light, and maybe that, more than anything, was what he had helped her do. Sarah had settled into the quiet rhythm of Oregon life, tucked between pine forests and the slow-moving Willamette River. She lived in a modest craftsman-style home, just 10 minutes from her sister's house, where her niece, Ava, now toddled through the backyard with wild curls and sticky hands. It was a different pace than Los Angeles, where every day used to begin with calendar alerts and end with last-minute changes. Here, the loudest sound at sunrise was birds. Each morning, she brewed her coffee slowly, no rush. She let the steam rise in silence and watched the golden light filter through the trees. In this stillness, she found something that had eluded her for years: peace without productivity. Her days were no longer measured in flights booked or interviews scheduled. They were measured in laughter, shared meals, and the way her niece looked up when Sarah read her stories. But she hadn't disappeared. Not completely. Sarah had begun teaching workshops at the local community center. They were small, unadvertised sessions mostly filled by word of mouth. Young women from all walks of life came in, some recent graduates unsure of their next steps, others burnt out from caregiving or high-pressure jobs. Sarah didn't stand at the front of the room with slides or titles. She sat in a circle with them, wearing jeans and a soft sweater, and asked the question no one had ever asked her. Who are you when no one needs you? The first time she asked that, the room went silent. One girl cried. Another whispered, I don't know. That was the beginning. Sarah didn't share everything about her past life. She didn't need to. But she spoke about boundaries, about giving without erasing yourself, about how loyalty can be a quiet form of self-betrayal if you're not careful. And when one of the girls asked, did you ever walk away from something you loved? Sarah smiled softly and said, yes. And that's when I learned what loving myself looked like. Back in Malibu, the energy inside Keanu's office had changed. His new assistant, Jordan, was fresh out of UCLA, smart, eager, and overwhelmed. The schedule alone was enough to make anyone sweat, but there was something else. A feeling she couldn't shake. Like she was stepping into shoes too big to fill. On her second week, while organizing the filing drawers, Jordan found a binder labeled continuity logs. Personal. Inside were Sarah's notes, dozens of them, typed, color-coded, and in some places handwritten, with warm little reminders. One yellow sticky read, Keanu forgets to eat when filming. Pack almonds. Jordan stared at it for a long time. She turned the page and found more Hamey notes, notes about which charities he liked to donate to around his birthday, the name of the barista who remembered his order, even reminders like, Kim calls every Friday. If he misses it, text her yourself. These weren't just logistics. They were pieces of a life Sarah had quietly held together. Jordan felt a lump in her throat. She'd been trying so hard to get everything right, to prove herself, but this was something else. Sarah hadn't just managed Keanu's schedule. She had cared for the soul of the man, not just the machine around him. It was as if she had poured her heart into every margin note, every folder tab, every backup plan he never saw. Later that afternoon, Keanu walked into the office. His usual calm demeanor shifted for a brief moment when he noticed Jordan sorting through the old notes. He said nothing, just walked to the far drawer of his desk, the one on the right. He hadn't opened it in weeks. Inside, resting alone, was the letter. The envelope was a little wrinkled now, the cream paper soft at the edges from handling. He slid it out, gently unfolded it, and read it again, though he already knew the words by heart. You taught me how to care deeply, but somewhere along the way I forgot to care for myself. And then, near the end, that final line, the one that always landed like a breath he didn't know he was holding. Thank you for trusting me with your world. Now, I'm learning to build my own. He folded the letter, placed it back, and closed the drawer, not as a goodbye, but as a way to keep her presence near. There was nothing bitter in the space she left behind, just the faint echo of a steady heartbeat that had once helped keep everything aligned. Outside, the sun began to dip lower across the Pacific. Keanu stood at the window, his silhouette long in the fading light. Somewhere in Oregon, he imagined, Sarah might be holding Ava, or teaching her girls, or simply breathing without urgency. And in that vision, he found a strange kind of peace. Not everyone stays forever, but some people leave behind more than they take. And when they do it with grace, it's not an ending, it's a legacy.